Now, what I'd like to do now is leave you with some closing thoughts on the notion of rationality outlined in the textbook. In chapter 1, so we have two approaches to the problem of decision making. And we have a preference-based approach where rationality consists of two axioms, right? Mainly the completeness and the transitivity of preferences. And we also have a choice-based approach to decision-making where we impose similar requirements of consistency of choice through various axioms of revealed preference. We have the weak axiom of revealed preference, the strong axiom of revealed preference. Now we may ask, what are the positive merits of these various axioms? And we could think of various reasons as to why people in the real world might not behave in accordance with these axioms, right? And in fact, the textbook on pages 7 and 8 gives some good examples of violation of the transitivity requirement. There's the issue of just perceptible differences, right, which is pretty much a cognitive limitation. I might have intransitive behavior because I'm not able to tell the difference between two alternatives, two shades of gray that are quite close, for example. Then there's the issue of framing issues you might be familiar with if you're interested in behavioral economics, where the formulation of the choice which is being presented to people does matter, right? And you also have potentially the issue of change in taste, right? So these are various examples of empirical phenomena that violates the transitivity requirement. But now I'd like to ask a different question and think a little bit more about the normative merits of the view of rationality outlined in the textbook, and ask, is this view of rationality overly narrow? Are we being too narrow? Now, it's interesting to note that there are some voices in the literature that challenge the normative merits of rationality in microeconomics. For example, Hilary Putnam gives a good example of an argument that could be made as to why the completeness requirement may not be appropriate in all circumstances. Now, there might be situations in life where I have not yet chosen between two alternatives. I have not yet formulated my preference relation, right? I simply do not know. Let's think about maybe some really important existential choice, my future career, right? I'm contemplating going to school to study law or going to school to study theology, right? And I simply have not yet decided. Now, if we impose the completeness of preferences, then we'll have to be indifferent, right? Because we're not able to choose law over theology or theology over law. And if we're not able to choose A over B or B over A, then really what we are is we are indifferent between the two. But that's simply not true, right? We have not yet chosen. So this difference between not yet having chosen and being indifferent is kind of interesting, right? And so, the view of rationality here that we have is that the human being is some kind of automata, right? This person has already decided everything, and they're so rigid, my goodness, right? It doesn't have to be that way, and it could be perfectly reasonable to not be so rigid and not yet having chosen, and being engaged in the process of deciding is indeed very much part of the business of living. Now, regarding the transitivity requirement, Amartya Sen has some really interesting examples, mainly menu dependence and chooser dependence, examples of situations where behavior could be intransitive and yet could be perceived as being perfectly rational because I have good reasons for behaving that way. And what these examples involve is that choice is not simply a function of the intrinsic properties of objects being chosen, but choice could be driven by something else, some external consideration. So to give you an example of menu dependence, if you think about this example, and it's kind of a funny example, I'm choosing between having coffee with a friend or going home, and I pick coffee or going home, right? But if I introduce a third alternative, if my friend says, well, we could also go to my place instead of having coffee and snort cocaine. Now, I might disagree with that and reassess the desirability of my friendship. And I might prefer to go home and not have coffee, right? So I have intransitive choice behavior, right? I prefer coffee over going home, but then I prefer going home over coffee if a third alternative has been introduced into the mix, right? Mainly the cocaine. And now you could argue that these are not different choices, that these are different choices, right? That having coffee with my friend, knowing about his cocaine habit versus not knowing about his cocaine habit, that these are different choices. But if you do that, you introduce a host of practical difficulties in terms of defining commodities. So this is not a very satisfying solution. Another example, which is interesting to think about, is the issue of chooser dependence. Now here I might prefer a big slice of chocolate cake to a small slice of chocolate cake, right? Because I love chocolate and I'm hungry. I'm at a party. But if I'm doing the choosing, I might choose the small slice of chocolate cake because I don't want to be perceived as rude. I don't want to be the person that grabs the biggest slice, right? But if somebody else chooses for me and offers the big slice, here, have the big slice, I'll be happy with that and I'll take the big slice. And the reason for that is, because my choice is driven not just by my preference for big or small slice, but also by norms, considerations of social norms, right? I want to be perceived as polite. Now, in both examples, choice is really driven not just by the intrinsic properties of the objects being chosen, but also by external considerations. And once you think about choice that way, you could have intransitive choices that are perfectly rational, because there's a reason for behaving in the way that you're behaving, right? So to conclude, what are the normative merits of this view of rationality, completeness, and transitivity of preferences? Really, it's all about our ability to describe behavior with a utility function, right? That's really what's at stake here, because if we allow for the possibility of intransitive behavior, we have a problem. We cannot describe preferences with a utility function. So the whole edifice breaks down, right? If we don't have utility function, we cannot be thought of as maximizing utility, and everything that follows in the textbook in terms of describing consumers breaks down, right? The framework is really dependent upon our ability to have utility functions. So that's really why we have this view of rationality. Is it mere mathematical convenience? I leave you to think about these issues. If you're interested, there is a blog entry on our blog, Reading Mascalel, on the INET website, which I encourage you to read and maybe respond to and leave some comments.